Derek Hammond walked into the federal courthouse with his head held high and his expensive leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. Derek Hammond walked into the federal courthouse with his head held high and his expensive leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. He had been practicing law for 20 years and had won more cases than he could count. His suit cost more than most people made in a month, and his watch was worth even more. Today he was representing Galactic Mining Corporation in a case that could cost his client billions of dollars if they lost. But Derek was not worried because he never lost cases that mattered. The courtroom was already filling up with people when Derek arrived. He set his briefcase down on the defense table and looked around with satisfaction. This was his world, and he knew how to control it. His assistant brought him a stack of files and whispered something about the judge. Derek nodded but did not really pay attention. He had already researched Judge Marcus Coleman and knew everything he needed to know. Judge Coleman was only 43 years old, which was young for a federal judge. He had been appointed just 2 years ago after spending most of his career as a public defender. Derek thought that was interesting because public defenders usually did not make it to the federal bench. They did not have the right connections or the right experience, but somehow Coleman had managed it. Derek had looked at photos of the judge online and noted that Coleman was black. That information had gone into Derek's mental file along with everything else he knew about the man. The bailiff called out for everyone to rise, and Judge Coleman entered the courtroom. He was tall and moved with quiet confidence as he took his seat behind the bench. His black robes were perfectly pressed and his expression was calm and professional. When he spoke, his voice was deep and clear. Everyone sat down and Judge Coleman reviewed the papers in front of him. Then he looked up at the lawyers and asked them to introduce themselves for the record. The prosecutor went first. She was a woman named Helen Carter from the Attorney General's office, and she spoke in a firm voice. Then it was Derek's turn. Derek stood up slowly and made sure everyone was looking at him before he spoke. He said his name and his law firm's name, and then he paused. He let a small smile appear on his face and said that he was surprised to see this case in Judge Coleman's courtroom. He said he would have thought such an important and complex case would be assigned to someone with more experience. The courtroom went completely silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment. Helen Carter's eyes went wide with shock. The people sitting in the gallery leaned forward in their seats. Everyone understood what Derek had just done. He had questioned the judge's ability to handle the case, and everyone knew why. Judge Coleman's face did not change at all. He looked at Derek with steady, calm eyes and said that he appreciated Derek's concern for efficiency. But he assured Derek that he was perfectly capable of handling the case. He mentioned that he had presided over 73 cases since his appointment, including 12 that involved interstellar commerce law. He said his credentials were public record if Derek wanted to review them. Derek's smile got wider. The judge had responded, which meant Derek had gotten under his skin. Derek said of course he meant no disrespect. He said he was just thinking about his client's interests. Maybe they could request a transfer to Judge Sullivan's court since Sullivan had 40 years of experience in these matters. Judge Coleman said the motion was denied in a flat voice. He explained that the case had been properly assigned through random selection as required by federal procedure. They would proceed with the case. He told Helen to present her opening arguments. But Derek was not finished yet. As Helen started talking, Derek made a show of shuffling papers loudly. He whispered to his assistant and generally made small noises that were just loud enough to be distracting. It was an old tactic designed to show that he did not take the proceedings seriously and to rattle the other side. Judge Coleman let it continue for exactly 90 seconds. Then he spoke in a firm voice and told Derek to give Helen the courtesy of his attention while she was speaking. Derek looked up with fake surprise and apologized. He said he was just reviewing documents and that in complex cases it was necessary to multitask. Judge Coleman told him it was his only warning and that the next disruption would result in sanctions. Derek nodded, but his expression showed that he thought the judge's authority was questionable. He sat back in his chair looking amused. Helen continued with her presentation and laid out the evidence against Galactic Mining Corporation. She showed that the company had deliberately established mining operations on 3 worlds that were home to developing intelligent alien species. The company had hidden their activities and bribed officials and used security forces to intimidate investigators when they got caught. The evidence was strong. There were satellite photos and testimony from whistleblowers and internal company documents that had been leaked. It was damning evidence and Derek knew it, but he had no intention of showing any concern. When it was his turn to respond, Derek stood up and walked toward the bench like he was talking to an equal instead of a superior. He said the government's case was built on speculation and hearsay and questionable documents. He said his client had operated in full compliance with all laws. He said the prosecution had not shown any concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Judge Coleman leaned forward and said he had the evidence files right in front of him, including signed corporate memos and authenticated recordings and testimony from former employees. How could Derek call that speculation? Derek waved his hand dismissively. He said those documents needed context. He paused as if choosing his words carefully. Then he said the documents required a more nuanced understanding of how interstellar corporations operated. He said these were complex business arrangements and not something that could be understood by someone who had spent their career in more local matters. The courtroom went absolutely silent again. Everyone understood what Derek was really saying. He was not just questioning the judge's experience. He was questioning his intelligence and his capability, and his right to sit on that bench. And he was doing it in a way that gave him an excuse to deny it later. He could always claim he was just talking about judicial experience. But everyone knew what he really meant, and everyone could hear the insult underneath his words. Judge Coleman set down his pen with slow, deliberate movements, and when he spoke, his voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath it now. He told Derek that he was going to give him an opportunity to rethink his approach to the proceeding. He said Derek seemed to be operating under several misconceptions, and he listed them carefully. First, that this court was somehow less capable of understanding the case than another court might be. Second, that Derek could disrupt the proceedings without consequence. Third, that Derek could speak to the bench with anything less than proper respect. Judge Coleman suggested that Derek correct these misconceptions before they continued. Derek smiled, and it was the smile of someone who thought he had already won. He said he had nothing but respect for the court, and was simply advocating zealously for his client, as was his duty as an attorney. Judge Coleman said that zealous advocacy did not include disrespecting the court or the judicial process. He pointed out that Derek was an experienced attorney who knew better. So the judge had to wonder what Derek's actual strategy was. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Derek felt a small flicker of uncertainty. This was not going quite as he had expected. He had thought Judge Coleman would become defensive or angry. Angry judges made mistakes and became emotional and created grounds for appeal. But Coleman remained perfectly controlled and perfectly calm. It was unsettling in a way Derek had not anticipated. Derek said there was no strategy, and he was simply ensuring his client received a fair hearing. Judge Coleman leaned forward and told Derek that he wanted to make sure Derek understood something clearly. He said fairness in his courtroom meant that everyone, regardless of their wealth or power or connections, would be treated according to the law. It meant that evidence would be evaluated on its merits. And it meant that attorneys would conduct themselves with professionalism. He asked Derek if they had an understanding. Derek nodded and kept smiling, but inside he was already planning his next move. He had dealt with idealistic judges before, and they all had breaking points. He just needed to find Judge Coleman's breaking point and push until the judge made a mistake. Then Derek would have grounds for an appeal and could get the case moved to a different court, with a more favorable judge. The hearing continued through the afternoon, and Derek kept up his subtle campaign of disrespect. He questioned every ruling and suggested that the judge did not understand the technical aspects of the case and generally behaved as though he considered the entire proceeding beneath him. He spoke to Judge Coleman with barely concealed condescension and made sure his body language conveyed his lack of respect. Every gesture and every word was calculated to undermine the judge's authority. But Judge Coleman did not rise to the bait. He remained calm and professional throughout the afternoon. He made his rulings based on the law and refused to be provoked into anger or defensiveness. It was masterful, and Derek found himself growing frustrated despite his best efforts to remain in control. This was not how things were supposed to go. Judges were supposed to crack under this kind of pressure, especially young judges with limited experience. Finally, as the day drew toward its close, Judge Coleman called for a recess. He said they would resume tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Then he said he wanted to see both attorneys in his chambers before they adjourned. Derek felt a spike of satisfaction. Maybe he had gotten to the judge after all. Maybe Coleman was going to lose his temper in private, where there would be no court. reporter to document it. In the judge's chambers, the walls were lined with law books and there were photographs of Coleman's family on the desk. The judge gestured for both Derek and Helen to sit down. Derek lounged in his chair, projecting boredom and superiority. Helen sat forward, looking attentive and curious. Judge Coleman said he was going to do something that might seem unusual. He said he was going to tell them a story. He told Helen she was welcome to stay and listen, though the story was primarily directed at Derek. Derek continued to look bored, but inside he was alert. This was unexpected, and he did not like unexpected things in court. Judge Coleman began by saying he grew up on Europa Station. His father had been a maintenance worker there, keeping the life support systems running. His mother had cleaned habitation units. They were the children of Earth immigrants who had taken the colony ships hoping for a better life. They had worked 16-hour days in zero gravity, breathing recycled air so that people like them could have opportunities their parents never had. He paused, and his eyes fixed on Derek with an intensity that made Derek stop lounging and sit up a bit straighter. Judge Coleman continued and said that when he was 10 years old, there had been an accident. A corporate executive from Earth had come to inspect the station. He was touring the industrial section with his security team. Coleman's father was working on a pressure seal when they came through. The executive, whose name was Charles Pemberton, had ordered his security to clear the corridor. They had physically grabbed Coleman's father and thrown him aside. He fell 3 levels in the light gravity and shattered his spine. Derek's expression shifted slightly. This was not what he had expected at all. Judge Coleman kept talking and explained that Pemberton's company claimed it was an accident. They said Coleman's father had been in a restricted area. They produced falsified documents showing that he had ignored safety protocols. Their attorney, who was an expensive lawyer from Earth, argued that the company bore no responsibility. He argued that Coleman's father, who was a poor black man who had worked on that station for 20 years, had brought his injuries on himself. Judge Coleman stood and walked to the window that overlooked the city. He said that his family had no money for an attorney, and they were assigned a public defender who was overworked and underpaid. She did her best, but she was up against a legal team that had unlimited resources. They lost the case. Coleman's father spent the rest of his short life in pain and unable to work, while Pemberton's company never paid a single credit in damages. Judge Coleman turned back to face Derek and Helen and said that experience had taught him something important. It taught him that the law as it existed on paper was beautiful. It promised equality and justice and protection for the vulnerable, but the law as it was actually practiced was often something very different. It was often a tool that the powerful used to maintain their power. And people like him and people who looked like him were supposed to accept that. They were supposed to know their place in the system. He paused and let those words sink in before continuing. He said that he had decided to learn the law. Not so he could make money, though God knows his family could have used it. He learned it so that he could be standing here right now in this position, ensuring that what happened to his father did not happen to others. He wanted to be the person who could stand between the powerful and the powerless and make sure the law actually meant what it said on paper. Judge Coleman returned to his desk and sat down, and his gaze never left Derek's face. He said that Derek had come into his courtroom that day with certain assumptions. Derek had assumed that because Coleman was young, and because he came up through the public defender's office, and because of the color of his skin, that he would be easy to manipulate. That Derek could rattle him and disrespect him and get away with it. That Coleman would lose his composure and give Derek grounds for an appeal. Derek opened his mouth to protest, but Judge Coleman held up a hand to stop him. He told Derek not to insult his intelligence by denying it. He said he had seen Derek's type before, and had faced attorneys like Derek dozens of times. He knew every trick in Derek's playbook because he had to learn how to counter them all, just to survive in the legal profession. The judge leaned forward and said that here was what Derek had not counted on. Every slight Derek had directed at him that day had been documented. Every improper comment and every disruption and every attempt to undermine the dignity of the proceedings. Tomorrow, when they resumed, Derek was going to conduct himself as a professional attorney should. Because if he did not, Judge Coleman was going to sanction him in ways that would make headlines, and then Coleman was going to preside over the case with perfect impartiality and ensure that justice was served based solely on the evidence and the law. Derek finally found his voice and started to say that he never intended any disrespect. Judge Coleman interrupted him and said yes, Derek did intend it and they both knew it. But here was Derek's chance to change course. Coleman said he was not interested in destroying Derek's career. He was interested in seeing that the case was decided fairly. So tomorrow, Derek could choose to be the attorney his law degree said he was supposed to be, or he could continue down his current path and face the consequences. It was Derek's choice. Judge Coleman stood up, which signaled that the meeting was over. He told them both to be in court at 9 o'clock the next morning and not to be late. Derek and Helen left the chambers in silence and walked down the hallway together. Helen looked at Derek with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. She did not say anything, but Derek could see the judgment in her eyes. She thought he had gotten what he deserved. Derek went back to his expensive apartment that night, but he could not sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling while his mind replayed the day's events over and over. He had miscalculated badly and he knew it. Judge Coleman was not the soft target he had assumed. The man had steel in him that had been forged by experiences Derek could not fully understand or relate to. But more than that, Coleman's words had gotten under Derek's skin in a way that surprised him. Derek had spent his entire career telling himself that he was just playing the game and using the tools at his disposal and advocating for his clients. He had never thought of himself as a bad person. He had simply thought of himself as good at his job. He was successful and wealthy and respected in his field. What more could anyone ask? Now alone in the dark, Derek was forced to confront an uncomfortable question. What was his job really? Was he serving justice or was he serving power? Was he part of a system that worked or part of a system that was broken? These were not questions he had ever asked himself before, and he did not like having to ask them now. He thought about his own father, who had been a successful corporate attorney. His father had taught Derek everything he knew about the law and about how to win cases. His father had been proud of Derek's success and had never questioned the morality of the clients they represented or the tactics they used. It was just business. Everyone deserved representation under the law. These were the principles Derek had built his career on. But Judge Coleman's story about his father had shaken something loose in Derek's mind. He thought about the maintenance worker on Europa Station who had been thrown aside by corporate power and legal maneuvering. He thought about Coleman's mother cleaning habitation units for 16 hours a day. He thought about the young Marcus Coleman watching his father suffer while the people responsible faced no consequences. Derek got up and poured himself a drink from the expensive bottle of whiskey on his counter. Through his window, he could see the lights of Chicago stretching out toward the horizon. Somewhere out there were the neighborhoods where people like Judge Coleman's parents had lived. The places where maintenance workers and custodians and all, the other people who kept society running, lived their lives largely invisible to people like Derek. He had never given much thought to those people before. They were abstract concepts and background figures in the story of his success, but Judge Coleman had made them real, had made them human, had forced Derek to see them as people who mattered just as much as his wealthy corporate clients, and now Derek could not unsee it. He thought about the case before the court and about the evidence Helen had presented. Galactic Mining Corporation had without question violated the Sentient Species Protection Act. Derek had read the internal documents himself. He had seen the proof. His client had knowingly exploited developing alien civilizations and had treated conscious beings as obstacles to profit rather than as entities deserving of rights and protection. Derek had planned to win this case through technicalities and procedural arguments and attacking the credibility of witnesses. He had planned to do what he always did, which was focus on the narrow legal questions and ignore the broader moral implications. He had been confident he could do it because he always did it. But could he still do that now? Did he want to do that? These questions kept Derek awake for most of the night, and when morning came, he still did not have clear answers. He showered and put on another expensive suit and drove to the courthouse, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about Judge Coleman's words and about the choice he had been given. He could continue being the attorney he had always been, or he could become something different. The question was which path he wanted to take. Derek arrived at the courthouse early and found himself standing in the hallway outside Judge Coleman's chambers. He stared at the door for several minutes, working up the courage to knock. Finally, at 8:30, he raised his hand and knocked twice. Judge Coleman's voice called out for him to come in. Derek entered and found the judge reviewing case files at his desk. Coleman looked up, and his expression was neutral and professional. He asked Derek if there was something he could help him with. Derek closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment trying to find the right words. Finally, Derek said he wanted to apologize for his conduct the previous day. He said it was not a strategic apology, or the kind of thing he would say just to get back in the judge's good graces. It was a real apology. He had been wrong in how he behaved, and wrong in his assumptions, and wrong in his treatment of the court. Judge Coleman leaned back in his chair and studied Derek's face carefully. He told Derek he was listening and Derek should continue. Derek took a breath and said he had come into the courtroom with preconceptions about Judge Coleman. He had made assumptions based on Coleman's age and background and, yes, his race. Derek admitted he had thought he could use those assumptions to his advantage. He thought he could manipulate the situation to benefit his client, and he was wrong to do that. Not just strategically wrong, but morally wrong. Derek explained that Judge Coleman's story about his father had been running through his mind all night. He said he realized something important. He had spent his career representing the Charles Pembertons of the universe, the executives and corporations who had power and money, and who used people like Coleman's father as disposable resources. Derek had told himself he was just doing his job and just providing representation, but that was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he chose to represent these clients because it was lucrative and prestigious, and he chose not to think too deeply about the consequences of his victories. Judge Coleman remained silent and let Derek continue talking. Derek said he had reviewed the evidence in the galactic mining case thoroughly. His client was guilty of everything they were accused of. They had knowingly exploited sentient alien species for profit. They had falsified documents and bribed officials and used force to cover their tracks. And Derek had been prepared to use every legal trick he knew to get them off anyway, or at least to minimize the consequences. Because that was what he did. That was what he had always done. Derek met Judge Coleman's eyes directly and said he did not want to be that person anymore. He said he did not know exactly what that meant for him going forward, but he knew what it meant for this case. When they went into the courtroom today, Derek was going to represent his client ethically and professionally, but he was not going to play games with the truth. If the evidence said his client was guilty, then Derek was not going to pretend otherwise. Judge Coleman was quiet for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly. He told Derek that he appreciated his candor. What Derek did with his career and what kind of attorney he chose to be was between Derek and his conscience. But Coleman would say this much. The law needed good people. It needed people who understood that justice was not just a word, but a living thing that required constant attention and constant effort to maintain. If Derek could be that kind of attorney, then he would have made something worthwhile out of this experience. Judge Coleman stood and extended his hand across the desk. Derek shook it firmly. The judge said they should go see how this case unfolded. They walked to the courtroom together, and Derek felt different, somehow. Lighter. Like he had put down a weight he had been carrying for 20 years without even knowing it was there. The courtroom was packed when the proceedings resumed. Word had spread about the confrontation the previous day, and legal observers and reporters had filled the gallery. Everyone was eager to see what would happen next. There was an electricity in the air as people whispered to each other and speculated about whether Derek would continue his aggressive tactics or back down. Judge Coleman took his seat and surveyed the room with his calm, steady gaze. He said they were resuming the preliminary hearing in United Earth Government versus Galactic Mining Corporation. He told Derek he could continue with his response to the government's motion for a preliminary injunction. Derek stood up and he looked different than he had the day before. His posture was less aggressive and his expression was more thoughtful. The smile was gone. Derek began by saying he had the opportunity to review the evidence more thoroughly since yesterday. He said he also had the opportunity to reflect on the court's observations about the importance of serving justice rather than simply serving clients. With that in mind, he needed to make several admissions on behalf of his client. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Helen Carter looked shocked. The corporate representatives from Galactic Mining sat up straight in their seats with alarm on their faces. Derek continued and said his client did establish mining operations on protected worlds. They did so knowingly with full awareness that these worlds were home to developing sentient alien species. The internal memoranda presented by the prosecution were genuine and were properly obtained. The testimony of the whistleblowers was accurate. Everything the government had accused his client of doing was true. The courtroom erupted in noise. Reporters were frantically typing on their devices. The gallery was buzzing with conversation. Judge Coleman had to use his gavel several times to restore order. When the room finally quieted, Derek continued speaking. He said he wanted to be clear about something. His client's actions, while illegal, were driven by what they perceived as competitive pressure. The Sentient Species Protection Act created certain costs and restrictions that not all interstellar competitors faced. Other corporations operating outside of United Earth government jurisdiction had been able to exploit resources that Earth-based companies could not legally access. His client made a choice to violate the law because they believed it was the only way to remain competitive. Derek looked directly at Judge Coleman and said he was not offering that as a legal excuse. A crime was still a crime regardless of the motive behind it, but he was offering it as context for sentencing and remediation. His client was prepared to accept responsibility for their actions. They would pay appropriate fines and work with the government to establish monitoring and compliance systems that would prevent future violations. They were also prepared to provide restitution to the affected alien species and to cooperate fully with any ongoing investigations. The courtroom was in complete chaos now. The corporate representatives from Galactic Mining were turning red with fury and looked like they wanted to strangle Derek right there in front of everyone. Helen Carter was trying to hide a smile behind her hand, but not succeeding very well. The reporters were practically climbing over each other to get better positions to observe what was happening. Judge Coleman gavelled for order again, and it took nearly a minute for everyone to settle down. When the room was finally quiet, Judge Coleman asked Derek if he was saying that his client was prepared to plead guilty to the charges. Derek said not exactly. They were prepared to stipulate to the facts as presented by the prosecution and to work with the government on an appropriate resolution. Whether that took the form of a guilty plea or a settlement agreement would need to be negotiated. But yes, they were accepting responsibility for what they had done. Judge Coleman nodded slowly and turned to Helen. He said he imagined she would like some time to discuss this development with her superiors at the Attorney General's office. Helen stood up and said yes, they would very much appreciate a continuance to explore the possibility of a settlement. Judge Coleman granted the continuance and said they would reconvene in 1 week. Then Judge Coleman said that given the defense's stipulations, he was granting the preliminary injunction. Galactic Mining Corporation would immediately cease all operations on the worlds in question and would cooperate with United Earth inspectors. Any violation of this order would result in contempt charges. He asked Derek if that was clear. Derek said yes, it was perfectly clear. Judge Coleman declared the court adjourned and brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. As the courtroom cleared, Derek found himself surrounded by furious corporate representatives from his client. One of them grabbed Derek's arm and hissed that Derek had lost his mind. What did Derek think he was doing? They had hired him to defend them, not to roll over and admit to everything. Derek pulled his arm free and looked at the man calmly. Derek explained that he was defending them by keeping them out of prison and potentially saving their company from complete destruction. The evidence against them was overwhelming. If they had fought this case and lost, which they absolutely would have, they would be facing maximum penalties and criminal charges for obstruction of justice. This way they could negotiate a settlement and pay fines that the company could afford and move forward with better compliance systems. It was the best outcome they were ever going to get given what they had done. The executive's face was purple with rage now. He told Derek that he was fired effective immediately. Derek just shrugged and said that was the executive's right. Derek would have his office send over the case files to their new counsel. He wished them good luck finding someone willing to defend the indefensible. Then he picked up his briefcase and walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter than he had felt in years. Derek's life changed dramatically over the next few weeks. His law firm asked him to resign after the case, citing his betrayal of a major client. Derek accepted without argument. He cleaned out his office and said goodbye to the few colleagues who were still speaking to him. Most of the other attorneys at the firm looked at him like he had lost his mind. They could not understand why anyone would throw away a lucrative career over principles. But Derek understood now. He understood that there were more important things than money and prestige. There were things like integrity and justice and being able to look at yourself in the mirror without feeling ashamed. These were things Derek had not valued for most of his career, but he valued them now. Within a month, Derek had joined the Attorney General's office. He took a position in the division that prosecuted corporate crimes. His salary was 70% less than what he had been making at his old firm. His new office was a fraction of the size and had old furniture and a window that looked out at a brick wall. But Derek did not care about any of that. For the first time in his career, he was doing work that actually mattered. His first case in his new position was against his old law firm. They were representing a pharmaceutical company that had sold defective medical equipment to Colony Worlds. The equipment had failed and dozens of people had died as a result. Derek knew all the tricks his old firm would use because he had taught them those tricks himself. But now he was on the other side, and he knew how to counter every move they made. The case took months to investigate and prepare. Derek worked long hours reviewing documents and interviewing witnesses and building the prosecution's case brick by brick. It was hard work and often frustrating, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way his old work had never been. He was fighting for people who had no power and no voice. He was making sure that the wealthy and powerful could not simply buy their way out of consequences. Meanwhile, the galactic mining case was moving forward toward settlement. The company agreed to pay the largest fine in the history of interstellar commerce law. They also agreed to provide substantial restitution to the affected alien species and to implement comprehensive monitoring systems to prevent future violations. 3 executives were charged with criminal violations and ended up serving brief prison sentences. The case became famous in legal circles. Law schools used it as a teaching example. Students studied Judge Coleman's handling of the situation and Derek's dramatic change of position. Professors debated whether Derek had done the right thing ethically and what it meant for the duty of zealous advocacy that all attorneys owed their clients, but for Derek the most important thing was not the attention or the analysis. It was the knowledge that he had finally chosen the right side. He had spent 20 years of his career helping the powerful exploit the powerless. He could not undo those years or take back the harm he had caused, but he could spend the rest of his career trying to balance the scales. Derek crossed paths with Judge Coleman occasionally at legal conferences or in courthouse hallways. They would nod to each other with understanding and sometimes exchange a few words. They never became close friends, but they had a mutual respect that was built on the foundation of that confrontation in the courtroom. They both knew they had changed each other in fundamental ways. One evening, about 6 months after the case concluded, Derek was at a legal aid fundraiser. He was manning a donation table and trying to drum up support for expanded public defender services. It was not glamorous work, but it was important. He was talking to a potential donor when he saw Judge Coleman approaching. The judge smiled and greeted Derek formally. He said he had heard about Derek's career change and that he was impressed by it. Derek laughed and said he was broke now. His apartment was tiny and his car was old and he was eating cheap food most days. But he had never been happier in his life. Judge Coleman said he knew exactly what that felt like. They stood together watching the other attendees at the fundraiser. After a moment, Judge Coleman said he had thought a lot about their conversation in his chambers. He wondered whether he had gotten through to Derek, or whether Derek would have changed anyway eventually. Derek said firmly that Coleman had gotten through to him. Everything the judge said about his father and about the system and about Derek's choices had been like holding up a mirror and forcing Derek to look at himself. Derek had not liked what he saw in that mirror. Judge Coleman nodded and said the thing about mirrors was that they only worked if you were willing to look. A lot of people in Derek's position would have walked away and convinced themselves that Coleman was just another bleeding heart liberal who did not understand how the real world worked. But Derek had not done that. Derek had looked at himself honestly and then he had changed. That took real courage. Derek said it took having his assumptions challenged by someone who had earned the right to challenge them. Coleman could have just sanctioned Derek and moved on with the case. Instead, he took the time to explain why Derek's behavior was wrong. Not just legally wrong, but morally wrong. That had made all the difference in Derek's transformation. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the fundraiser continue around them. Then Derek asked Judge Coleman a question he had been wondering about. He asked if Coleman had been angry that first day in court when Derek was trying to undermine him. Because Coleman had seemed so calm, but it must have been incredibly frustrating to deal with Derek's behavior. Judge Coleman thought about the question before answering. He admitted that yes, he had been angry, but he had learned long ago that anger without discipline was just noise. What he felt that day was righteous anger. which was the kind that came from seeing injustice and having the power to do something about it. But he channeled that anger into something productive. He used it to teach rather than to punish. Coleman looked at Derek directly and said he could have destroyed Derek in that courtroom. He could have sanctioned him and held him in contempt and reported him to the Bar Association. Part of Coleman wanted to do exactly that, because what Derek was doing was not just disrespecting Coleman personally. It was disrespecting every person of color who had fought to have a place in the legal profession. Every black attorney and every black judge who had faced similar treatment. But Coleman said he realized that making an example of Derek would not change anything fundamental. The system that produced Derek would just produce another attorney exactly like him. The only way to actually make a difference was to change Derek's mind and not just punish his behavior, so that was what Coleman chose to do. Derek felt emotion welling up in his throat. He told Coleman he was sorry, not just for what he did in the courtroom, but for all the years he spent being part of the problem instead of part of the solution. Coleman put a hand on Derek's shoulder and said that Derek should make sure the rest of his career counted for something. He should be the attorney he should have been from the beginning. That would be the best apology Derek could possibly offer. Over the next several years, Derek threw himself into his work at the Attorney General's office. He prosecuted corporations that broke environmental laws. He went after companies that exploited workers. He fought against fraud and corruption wherever he found it. His win record was impressive, but more importantly, the cases he won actually made a difference in people's lives. He also started speaking at law schools about legal ethics and about his own journey from corporate defense attorney to prosecutor. Students were fascinated by his story. Some of them saw themselves in the young Derek Hammond, and his story gave them pause. It made them think about what kind of attorneys they wanted to become. Derek was always honest in these talks. He did not pretend he had been a monster or that his transformation had been easy. He explained that he had been a person who made bad choices, and that changing required confronting uncomfortable truths about himself. He talked about privilege and about how easy it was to ignore injustice when you benefited from the system that created it. And he always talked about Judge Coleman. He told the story of that day in court and about the conversation in chambers. He explained how Coleman had challenged him without destroying him, and had given him a path to redemption. Derek made sure the students understood that change was possible, but only if you were willing to do the hard work of examining your own beliefs and behaviors. 5 years after the Galactic mining case, Derek found himself back in federal court prosecuting a major pharmaceutical company. The company had knowingly sold defective medical equipment to Colony Worlds, and dozens of people had died as a result. It was exactly the kind of case Derek used to defend, and now he was on the prosecution side. The defense attorney used every trick Derek had ever employed: procedural delays and technical objections and attempts to overwhelm the prosecution with paperwork. Derek recognized all the tactics because he had invented some of them himself. But he also knew how to counter them now. He met each move with patience and determination. The trial lasted 8 months. The defense fought hard and brought in expensive expert witnesses and tried to confuse the jury with complex technical testimony. But Derek kept the focus on the simple facts. The company knew the equipment was defective. They sold it anyway because fixing it would have been expensive. People died because of that decision. It was not complicated. In the end, the jury found the pharmaceutical company guilty on all counts. The families of the victims received substantial compensation. The executives who made the decision to sell the defective equipment were criminally convicted and went to prison. It was a complete victory for justice. As Derek packed up his files after the verdict, Helen Carter approached him. She was the Attorney General now, and she congratulated Derek on his excellent work. Derek thanked her and admitted the case would have been easier if the defense attorney had not been so skilled at stalling and obstructing. Helen laughed and said Derek should know since he wrote the playbook the defense was using. Derek winced at the reminder of his old career, but Helen was right. The difference was that now Derek knew those tactics and could beat them. Helen asked jokingly if his redemption arc was complete. Derek said thoughtfully that he did not think redemption was ever really complete. It was a process and not a destination. Every day he had to choose to be the person he wanted to be, rather than the person he used to be. Some days were easier than others. Helen said that was pretty philosophical for a lawyer. Derek smiled and said he had a good teacher. He nodded toward the bench where Judge Coleman was gathering his papers. Coleman had been assigned to preside over this case, and his handling of it had been, as always, impeccably fair and professional. Helen suggested that Derek should talk to the judge before leaving. She thought Coleman would appreciate knowing how things had turned out. Derek approached the bench as the courtroom emptied. Judge Coleman looked up and smiled when he saw Derek. He congratulated Derek on the victory and said it had been excellent work. Derek thanked him and said that Coleman's rulings on the admissibility of evidence had made all the difference. Coleman said he just applied the law. Derek was the one who built the case. They walked together toward the exit, and their footsteps echoed in the empty courtroom. Derek asked Coleman if he ever thought about that first case they worked on together. The galactic mining case that had changed everything. Coleman said he thought about it often and asked why Derek was asking. Derek said he thought about it every single day. It was the day his life changed. The day he stopped being who he was and started becoming who he is now, and he wanted Coleman to know that he was grateful for it. He was grateful for the conversation in chambers and for Coleman's willingness to teach rather than simply punish. Judge Coleman stopped walking and turned to face Derek fully. He said the most amazing thing about that day was not that he managed to get through to Derek. It was that Derek was willing to listen. Coleman explained that he had confronted dozens of attorneys about their behavior over the years, and out of all of them only Derek had actually changed. Just one. Coleman shook his head with a rueful expression. He said most people, when confronted with their own biases and shortcomings, doubled down on their behavior. They got defensive. They convinced themselves that they were right and everyone else was wrong. But Derek had not done that. Derek had the humility and the courage to admit he was wrong and to change course. That was rare. That was precious. And that was why Coleman remembered the case so fondly, despite how it started. Derek said he only changed because Coleman made it impossible for him to keep lying to himself. Coleman held up a mirror, as Derek had said before. But Coleman did it with dignity and wisdom rather than with anger and condemnation. Coleman gave Derek a path to redemption instead of just telling him he was a terrible person. That made all the difference. Judge Coleman said something that surprised Derek. He said Derek was never a terrible person. Derek was a person who had made terrible choices. There was a difference between those two things. Terrible people did not change no matter what you said to them. People who made terrible choices could choose differently if they were willing to do the hard work. They resumed walking and emerged into the late afternoon sunlight outside the courthouse. Judge Coleman told Derek that he had a hope for the future. He hoped that someday Derek would be standing where Coleman was standing. He hoped Derek would become a judge himself, because Derek understood now what justice really meant. It was not just about rules and procedures, though those were important. It was about protecting the vulnerable from the powerful. It was about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their race or wealth or status, had access to the law's protection. Coleman pointed out that Derek had lived on both sides of that divide now. He had been the attorney who defended the powerful, and now he was the attorney who prosecuted them. That perspective would make Derek an excellent judge. The system needed people like Derek, people who understood what it was like to be part of the problem and who had chosen to become part of the solution. Derek was stunned by the suggestion. He did not know what to say. Judge Coleman told him to think about it. When Derek had put in his time at the Attorney General's office and built up his experience and his reputation, he should consider submitting his name for appointment to the bench. The system needed judges who understood these issues from personal experience. Derek promised that he would think about it. They shook hands, and Derek felt the weight of the moment. Two men who had started as adversaries had become unlikely allies in the ongoing struggle for justice. It was not the ending Derek would have predicted 5 years ago, but it was the ending he needed. As Derek walked to his car, he thought about Judge Coleman's words. The idea of becoming a judge was both terrifying and exciting. To sit where Coleman sat, to have the power to shape outcomes, to protect the vulnerable and hold the powerful accountable. It was an enormous responsibility, but also an incredible opportunity. Derek thought about Coleman's father and about all the people like him. The maintenance workers and custodians and all the others who worked hard and played by the rules, but got crushed by a system that valued profit over people. Derek thought about the role he had played in that system for so many years, the clients he defended and the victories he won, and the people who were hurt by his success. He could not undo those years. He could not take back the harm he caused, But he could spend the rest of his career trying to balance the scales. He could be the attorney and maybe someday the judge who stood up for people who had no one else to stand up for them. It would not make him a hero. It would not erase his past. But it would mean something. It would matter. Derek got in his car and started the engine. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he caught sight of Judge Coleman in his rearview mirror. The judge was standing on the courthouse steps looking up at the building where he spent his days, trying to bend the arc of justice toward fairness. Derek understood now. He understood what Coleman had known all along, that justice was not something that just happened automatically. It was something you fought for every day, one case at a time, one person at a time, one moment at a time. And that fight was worth every sacrifice it required. The courtroom confrontation that started with shame and disrespect had ended with redemption and hope, not because of any grand gesture or dramatic moment, but because two men had been willing to see each other as human beings, because one man had been willing to teach and another had been willing to learn. Derek drove home thinking about the future, thinking about the cases he would prosecute and the difference he would make, thinking about the possibility of becoming a judge someday and having the chance to do for others what Coleman had done for him. It was a long road ahead, but for the first time in his life, Derek felt like he was on the right path. The story of Derek and Judge Coleman spread through the legal community. It was told in law schools and discussed in legal journals. But the real story was not about the confrontation or the case outcome. The real story was about how two people had made each other better, how they had created something good out of conflict, how they had proven that redemption was possible, and that justice, while imperfect, was worth pursuing. Over the years, Derek continued to prosecute important cases. He won more often than he lost, and his reputation grew. But he never forgot where he came from or how he got to where he was. He never forgot that day in Judge Coleman's courtroom when his entire worldview was challenged and changed. And he never forgot the lesson that Coleman taught him about what it meant to be a good attorney and a good person. Derek started mentoring young lawyers at the Attorney General's office. He taught them about ethics and about the responsibility that came with their law degrees. He told them his story not to make himself look good, but to show them that it was never too late to change course, that you could make mistakes and still find your way back to the right path if you were willing to do the work. Some of the young lawyers listened and took his words to heart. Others did not and went on to become the kind of attorneys Derek used to be. Derek understood that he could not save everyone, but he could try to make a difference for those who were willing to listen. Just like Judge Coleman had made a difference for him, the legal system was still imperfect. There were still attorneys who used their skills to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. There were still judges who let their biases influence their decisions. There were still people who fell through the cracks because they could not afford good representation. Derek saw all of this and it frustrated him. But he also saw progress. He saw more attorneys like him choosing to work for justice instead of just for money. He saw more judges like Coleman who took their responsibility seriously. He saw the system slowly getting better even if the progress was sometimes maddeningly slow. And Derek was part of that progress now. He was no longer part of the problem. He was part of the solution. That knowledge sustained him through the long hours and the difficult cases and the frustrations that came with trying to fight against powerful interests. He knew that his work mattered. He knew that he was making a difference even if it was just one case at a time. 10 years after that fateful day in Judge Coleman's courtroom, Derek Hammond stood in a different courtroom for a very different reason. He was being sworn in as a federal judge. The ceremony was attended by his colleagues from the Attorney General's office and by family members, and by many of the people whose lives he had touched over the past decade. And sitting in the front row was Judge Marcus Coleman, who had taken time from his busy schedule to witness this moment. Derek's hands shook slightly as he placed his hand on the law book and took the oath of office. He promised to administer justice without respect to persons and to faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of his office. These were not just words to Derek, they were a sacred commitment. They were a promise to be the kind of judge that Coleman had been for him. The kind of judge who understood that justice was about people and not just about laws. After the ceremony, there was a small reception in one of the courthouse conference rooms. People came up to congratulate Derek and to wish him well in his new position. Derek shook hands and thanked everyone, but his eyes kept drifting to where Judge Coleman stood talking quietly with Helen Carter, who had come to represent the Attorney General's office. Finally, Derek made his way over to them. Helen excused herself with a smile, leaving Derek and Coleman alone. The two men looked at each other for a moment, and then Coleman extended his hand. Derek shook it firmly. Coleman said he was proud of Derek and knew that Derek would be an excellent judge. Derek felt emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Derek told Coleman that none of this would have been possible without him. Without that conversation in chambers 10 years ago, without Coleman's willingness to teach instead of just punish, without the example Coleman had set every day of what it meant to be a good judge. Derek said he owed Coleman everything. Coleman shook his head gently. He said Derek did not owe him anything. Derek had done the hard work of changing himself. Coleman just held up a mirror. Derek was the one who looked into it honestly and decided to be different. That took courage that came from within Derek himself. But Coleman said there was one thing he wanted Derek to remember as he began his judicial career. He wanted Derek to remember how he felt that day when he walked into Coleman's courtroom, full of arrogance and assumptions. How it felt to be challenged, how it felt to have your worldview shaken. Coleman said Derek should remember those feelings because they would help him be compassionate toward the attorneys who appeared before him, even the ones who tested his patience. Coleman explained that every attorney who came into Derek's courtroom would be on their own journey. Some would be where Derek was 10 years ago. Some would be further along. Derek's job was not just to apply the law, but to help guide them toward being better attorneys and better people. Just like Coleman had guided Derek, Derek promised he would remember. He said he would try to be the kind of judge Coleman had been for him. Patient and firm and wise, willing to teach and not just punish, committed to justice for everyone who came through his courtroom doors. Coleman smiled and said that was all anyone could ask. They talked for a while longer about Derek's new responsibilities and about the challenges he would face. Coleman shared advice based on his own years on the bench. He talked about how to manage a heavy caseload and how to deal with difficult attorneys, and how to make sure you did not let the job consume you. It was practical wisdom born of experience, and Derek listened carefully to every word. Eventually, the reception wound down and people began to leave. Derek walked Coleman out to the courthouse steps where they stood looking out at the city. It was early evening and the sun was setting behind the tall buildings, casting long shadows across the streets. Coleman said this was his favorite time of day. The quiet moment between the busy workday and the peaceful evening. Derek asked Coleman if he ever thought about retiring. Coleman laughed and said he thought about it sometimes, but he was not ready yet. There was still work to do, still cases to hear, still attorneys to guide, still justice to pursue. He would know when it was time to step down, but that time had not come yet. Derek understood. He felt the same way about his new position. He was just beginning, but he already knew this was what he was meant to do. This was how he would spend the rest of his career, sitting on the bench and trying to make the system work the way it was supposed to work, protecting the vulnerable and holding the powerful accountable, following the example Coleman had set. They said their goodbyes and Coleman walked down the courthouse steps to his car. Derek watched him go and thought about the long, strange journey that had brought them both to this moment. From that confrontational first day, to this moment of mutual respect and shared purpose. It had been a difficult journey, but a necessary one. And Derek was grateful for every step of it. Derek went back inside the courthouse and walked through the empty hallways to his new chambers. His name was already on the door. Judge Derek Hammond. He ran his fingers over the nameplate, feeling the weight of what it represented. This was not just a title or a position. It was a responsibility, a sacred trust, a chance to make a real difference in people's lives. He sat down at his desk and looked around the office. The walls were bare and the bookshelves were empty. He would fill them over time with his own law books and his own photographs. He would make this space his own. But he would also keep a photograph of Judge Coleman on his desk. A reminder of where he came from and what he had learned. A reminder of the man who had changed his life by refusing to give up on him. Derek thought about all the attorneys who would appear before him in the coming years. Some would be skilled and professional. Others would be inexperienced and nervous. Some would try to manipulate him or test his authority, and Derek would treat them all with fairness and patience. He would apply the law impartially, but he would also remember that they were human beings on their own journeys. And sometimes the most important thing a judge could do was help them find their way. He thought about the people who would come to his courtroom seeking justice, the workers who had been exploited, the families who had been harmed, the vulnerable who had no power and no voice. These were the people Derek would serve. These were the people who mattered most, not the wealthy corporations or the powerful executives, but the ordinary people who trusted that the legal system would protect them. Derek made a silent promise to himself and to those future people. He would never forget where he came from. He would never forget the attorney he used to be and the harm he used to cause. He would carry that knowledge with him every day as a reminder of why his work mattered, and he would spend the rest of his career trying to be worthy of the trust that had been placed in him. The sun had fully set now, and the courthouse was quiet. Derek sat in his new chambers and felt a sense of peace. He had found his purpose. He had found his way, and he would spend the rest of his life fighting for justice, one case at a time. Just like Judge Coleman had taught him, the story of Derek Hammond and Marcus Coleman would be told for years to come in law schools and legal circles. It would be used as a teaching example of judicial temperament and professional ethics and the possibility of redemption. But for Derek and Coleman, the story was personal. It was about two men who had changed each other's lives through courage and honesty and compassion. Judge Coleman continued, his work on the federal bench becoming known as one of the most respected judges in the district. His rulings were studied and cited. His courtroom manner was praised. But more importantly, he continued to guide young attorneys and to fight for justice every day. He never forgot his father or the lessons he had learned growing up. And he never stopped trying to make the legal system work better for everyone. Judge Derek Hammond began his own judicial career with determination and humility. He approached every case with care and every person with respect. He made mistakes sometimes because he was human, but he learned from those mistakes and kept trying to do better. And slowly over the years, he built a reputation as a fair and thoughtful judge who understood that justice was about more than just following rules. The two judges remained friends and colleagues for the rest of their careers. They would sometimes have lunch together and talk about their cases and their challenges. They would share advice and support each other through difficult times. And they would remember that day 10 years ago when everything changed. When one man chose to teach and another chose to learn. When two adversaries became allies in the pursuit of justice. That was the real legacy of their story. Not the legal precedents or the famous case, but the simple human truth that people could change. That understanding could bridge divides. That redemption was possible when we chose to fight for it with wisdom and courage and compassion. That justice was worth pursuing even when it was hard. And that sometimes the most important thing we could do was help each other become better than we were.